who had his trajectory in life, what he thought he was going to do, rearranged by an encounter he had with God. And that was a lot of years ago when there was a lot of other agendas. The National Guard visited us on a regular basis at the University of Illinois. Chem labs used to get blown up, just interesting things like that. But God was doing some extraordinary things in those days when violence was a part of the U of I, and you never knew when you went to bed if you were going to wake up and the dorm was still going to be there. So I think about that, and I think about many years later being here in Berkeley. And then I think about a couple of years ago when, as Earl mentioned, Earl and Jan were part of our organization back in the Midwest. And he said, Byron, I'm taking a trip out to Berkeley. And I said, well, hey, great. You know, it's a great place. Have a good time. And he came back, and I knew that he had had an extraordinary encounter with God. I knew that it had been a defining moment for him. And he said that both Earl and Jen had said that, in a sense, God had removed all their defenses, and they were defenseless against what God spoke to them here when they came to this place. And, you know, we see the sort of fruit of that. And I think that's an important part. As I do get older in life, I'm less hesitant to shoot straight about things. I just mince less words than I used to. I'm not really worried about impressing anything. There's something in my heart that is really critical for you. What happened to me when a guy named Dick Foth came from Cal Berkeley to the University of Illinois and impacted my life. It happened, it's happening to you as you meet Earl and Jan here at Berkeley. And we live in a day and a time, you know, one of my favorite authors, a guy named Robert Weber, who's dead now, but he wrote a book called Who Gets to Narrate the World? And I think that we're in a season right now where obviously political opponents would argue that their narration of the world is the one that we ought to side with. But we live in a day and a world where, as followers of Jesus, we are not the only narration of the world that is offered to this world. And so I think that it's important for us to realize in seats of power, like where we are right now, that the forms of power that we accumulate and think are substantive and think enough to narrate the world with completeness may have more liabilities than we think. That in a sense, every one of us has the natural tendency to build a kingdom of our own and call it great, when in fact it may not be as great as we think. And I think that every one of us who has human vision, you know, you haven't come here to study to pass the time of day. My guess is you've come here because there's a particular trajectory that for some reason, somebody's influenced you, some experience you've had, and you've taken that path. You might have switched 3 or 4 times, but you're headed in a direction that has some purpose to it. As a follower of Jesus, that sort of integrates into that equation of life and where you're headed. And I guess I want to suggest to you tonight that in the Bible there are folks who are worth looking at, who faced similar situations as you are in right now, a time of learning, a time of development, a time of, in a sense, building a foundation for where you're headed, who didn't quite meet with the kind of direction that they thought might be. Moses is one of those. Second book of the Old Testament, Exodus, is really the story of Moses. He's a fascinating leader. And I want to start at a particular point in his life. He's at a point of great frustration. He's in charge of millions of refugees who have left a place they've been for hundreds of years in Egypt. They have been under an oppressive, unjust system. And you would think that they'd want to go where God was directing them. But about a week out on their journey, they start complaining about the fact that they don't have the food that they are used to. Now granted, they've lived in injustice for 400 years, and they're worried about cucumbers and onions. Okay. So this is the kind of crowd he's leading. Now, you can start at Exodus 1, you can see his whole story, but I want to start towards the end of this story, which is in Exodus 33. And he has an encounter with God that is, for me, paradigmatic. It provides for us, I think, some substance for what I think is important for every one of us to learn as we follow Jesus and listen to his voice and obey him in those directions that God is leading us. So here's Moses. He is in a mess. He's leading millions of people. They don't particularly like him, and he is in a quandary. This is Exodus 33, starting verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "You've been telling me, lead these people, but you not let me know who you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you've found favor with me. If you're pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." Remember that this nation is your people. You gave them to me, but they're yours. I really don't want to identify them. Yeah. The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses said to him, this is a conversation between God and Moses, If your presence, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all other people on the face of the earth?" That is really a serious conversation. What will distinguish me from all of the people on the face of the earth? Who gets to narrate the world? Whose voice, whose message? What will distinguish us from all of the voices and all our great causes? A lot of people filled with hope in their lives. Now, how does Moses get to this point? Well, let's think about Moses. Moses is not just a leader of folks out in the desert. He has been raised. His story, go back to Exodus 1, his story is that he's a Jewish child who by some circumstance gets rescued by an Egyptian princess in a time when there's a genocide going on little Jewish boys. So she rescues him, and guess what? This kid who should have been killed gets raised in the household of Pharaoh, one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Their mathematics, their science, their engineering is still under study today, wondering how in the world it occurred. So he's raised in that household. He's not only raised in a scientific atmosphere, he's raised to be a leader. He's in Pharaoh's household. So this guy understands foreign policy, he understands all kinds of stuff. And he is raised to lead. He's in these families. You're in a sense, you're socialized into what it means to be a leader. Now he goes through, a series of ups and downs. He gets himself in an identity crisis. He murders somebody. He ends up out in the desert. It's a very circuitous route. But through another series of encounters with God, like talking in a burning bush, Moses ends up leading his ethnic group out of Egypt back to where they came from. So his story now is he's leading millions of people out in this desert from Egypt up to Sinai, back up to what is today Israel. Okay? There's millions of people. It's not exactly what you call a coordinated camping trip. These people are just, it's a miserable deal. So during this time, we go back to chapter 31, 32. He goes up to a mountain to have this encounter with God. He gets the 10 Commandments. He has this series of guidelines that God gives, written by, it says, the finger of God. comes down from this encounter with God, and he's left his brother in charge, Aaron. He comes down and he finds out that Aaron has screwed things up big time. The people have said, our leader is gone. Yeah. We don't have a connection to God. So let's make our own God. And Aaron says, hey, I'll help you out. Bring all of your jewelry and we'll make an object. Bible says it's a golden calf. Whatever it was humanly devised from the jewelry they had. Now think of the irony of this. When they left Egypt, what kind of things do you think they took with them? Not only took their own jewelry, they took all the jewelry they could find. And here they are with stolen goods, their own stuff, and they've created their own God. Moses comes back. He has had this, he's met with God. God has spoken to him. He comes back and his brother has screwed it up. So here he is, this great leader, schooled, science background, foreign policy background. He's now in charge of this group. He leaves for a little bit. His brother screws it up. And if you read in chapter 32, it's one of those parts of the Old Testament that, frankly, I can't explain. There's stuff happens there that I don't have full explanation for. And we'll just leave it at that. I can't explain everything. But the bottom line is that Moses finds himself in a desperate situation. Schooled, professional, skilled, given a task, and realizes that he does not have the goods. So, interestingly enough, in chapter 33, he's getting pretty desperate here. And he does something very, very interesting. In chapter 33, verse 7, he says, "Now Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away, calling it the tent of meeting." So Moses, skilled, experienced, educated, professional, asked by God to lead this great journey out of injustice to a land of hope, is at a desperate point. And he creates this place, this sacred place. We Christians, followers of Jesus, don't necessarily understand sacred places. Muslims actually do it much better. They say this is a place where we meet God. It is a sacred place. This is where we do really eternal business. And he sets up one of those places. All the stuff that he has counted on doesn't work. And he says, I need to get down to real basics. And he decides to set aside this sacred place, a tent of meeting, he calls it, where he can encounter God in extraordinary ways. Now, I'm probably the oldest person in this room. And I've been in over 60 nations of the world. And I have seen injustice. I have seen tragedy. I worked a whole decade with relief and development work in some of the war-torn parts of Latin America in the middle of civil wars. I've seen human attempts to make things right. I've seen them from the right and the left politically. I've seen a lot of that. Valiant attempts to bring about equilibrium in life. And the more I've seen those, and the more I've seen those attempts, I am willing to side with the Apostle Paul, who said, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God unto salvation, to change the realities of human beings and transform their lives. I've given my best attempts. I've analyzed and strategized. I've connected with government agencies. I've done it all. And all those things are valuable and things that I will continue to do. But when it comes to the eternal dimensions of life, the kinds of trajectories that I believe God is directing in your lives, there has to be an addition to that equation where you are subservient and Jesus Christ is Lord. Moses understands that, and he finds that place. So in one of these encounters, we see this discussion, the discussion that I read. And he asks this distinguishing, haunting question. If your presence doesn't go with us as a people, now remember, this people that he is leading are in a sense the physical representation of God. This is a community of folks who say we belong to the one true God. And they are the visible representation of the character of this one true God. And they have screwed it up royally. So he says, if we continue this journey, how will anybody know the difference between us and every other cause on the face of the earth? Every other vision of the future. As we journey through this desert and we go to that land you've called us to. Everybody's country we go through, how will they view us? So he says, well, if you don't go with us, let's just call it off right now. Don't send us up from this place. I'm not one of those, I don't know how you are, but in my Bible, in my paper Bible, not just in my iPhone Bible, but my paper Bible, the verses that I read to you here are the only verses I have underlined. Some people underline everything, write all kinds of notes. I don't know if you're that kind of person. This is the only place that I have highlighted. Okay? Because for me, this is the most haunting question. I'm a follower of Jesus. I believe that the message of Jesus Christ and the cause of Jesus Christ is worth identifying with. And I think it is supreme. But I realize that there are competing voices that are just as passionate as I am. So what will distinguish my voice? What will distinguish our voice from all the competitors to the rest of the world? He says it's the presence of God. Now, one could say, well, that's it's sort of a tingling that you feel when you've sung the right song. Or whatever it does it for you, okay? I don't know what that is. But really, it's a much more observable thing. It starts with you. It starts with it starts with the realization. I have this favorite African American preacher. His name is T.D. Jakes. He says, "Let me tell you something about life. God is and you ain't." And yeah, you're right. Okay, that's a very crass way of putting it, but it's truthful. Okay, God is and you ain't. There, in a sense, there's a sense of priority here. There's a sense of what is superior and what is less. And the presence of God in my life, first of all, changes me. It makes me realize that I have tendencies to live life by my own rules and call it great. When in fact, to follow Jesus is to understand that my rules have my life and the rules that I have lived my life by come up short. And that he is asking me to recognize the kinds of songs we sang tonight, in a sense, led us into that realization. That to encounter Jesus Christ is to realize that the equation has been altered significantly. So Moses said, if your presence doesn't go with us, is your steady influence that changes us from the inside out and demonstrates itself in observable character and action that is observed by those around us. Unless that goes with us, let's just call it off right now. So for me, this encounter that Moses has is a really, really big deal. In this tent of meeting, in this sacred place that he carves out, where he realizes that all of what he has brought to the plate and what even God has directed him to do is more than the resources he humanly has accumulated to do that job. There's another quick person I want to reference in the Old Testament. His name is Isaiah. He's a prophet who is a significant part of the Old Testament. Isaiah chapter 6 is another one of my favorite spots. You always know when a speaker has a favorite place in the Bible, because wherever they start, they can end up at that favorite spot. So, I'll try to end up here. Isaiah, at the beginning of his ministry, the beginning of his career, has an encounter with God, and you see it in Isaiah 6. It is a significant picture of an encounter that Isaiah has with God, and so powerful is it that Isaiah says he sees heaven. And in that place, he says, there are cherubims. Cherubims are like a class of angels that all they do is worship God 24 hours a day. That's all they do. So he's in this place. He says it's so powerful. This encounter he has with God is so powerful that the cherubims are, in a sense, in worship to God, and he observes that. He says it's so powerful it shakes the very foundations of heaven, and that obviously is a human way of trying to figure out how to verbalize what he sees. He has an encounter with God, and he basically says, oh God, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips. God sends one of these cherubims to cleanse his lips, symbolically, demonstrating that Isaiah has recognized his allegiance and necessary allegiance to God. And then God asks him a question. He says, Isaiah, who will go for me? In other words, are you ready to serve me? And Isaiah says, here am I, send me to do the job. Now he's had this internal encounter with God. God then, in a sense, says, okay, not only do you need to feel good about being in my presence, but it ought to have some significance to the things you do every day. And Isaiah says, I'll do whatever you want. God says, okay. And he gives him an assignment. And you can read on in Isaiah 6, God gives him an assignment, and Isaiah says, how long am I going to have to do this? Which the assignment is to go and speak to his countrymen who are fallen from God. And God says you're going to preach, and the more you preach, the less they're going to listen. And in fact, it's going to go on until an enemy comes and takes them away into captive. Now, I don't know about you, but when God gives me some direction in life, I don't want to hear there's going to be a failure in the end. That's what he does. But the point here is that this tent of meeting, this sacred place, this encounter with God should so overwhelm us that the direction that God gives us is simply something we obey because he has spoken. One last scripture. It's found in 2 Corinthians 5:20. It says, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal to us. Be reconciled to God. We are Christ's ambassadors. We represent Jesus. Followers of Jesus represent Jesus. They represent his presence. They represent his character. They represent his integrity. They represent the kind of transformation that can take place in lives. First of all, in our own. So that in our interactions with those people around us, we have opportunity to say, when given opportunity, this is why I act this way. This is why I treat people this way. This is why certain causes are part of my allegiance. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. Be reconciled to God. When people think of you, what kind of appeal do they think you're making? That's just, when they think of 360 Church, when people who know about this place think about 360 Church, what do they think of? What kind of appeal are we making corporately to this community? Those are serious questions. And as we realize that we are in a competing world, where our narration of the world is in competition against a lot of other narrations, the question becomes, what kind of appeal will we make to people around us? Will it simply be the latest fad? Or will it be something that has transformed us first? That has so refined our lives that we are willing to put aside the reliance that we have had on the sources of power we have relied upon and give those allegiances to the King of the universe. Now, I don't know about you, but I simply don't believe, as a follower of Jesus, that I am going to be able to convince those inquiring by merely my words, my slickness, my capability to out-slick them or whatever. There is too much at stake to over-rely on the significant resources that God may have placed in your life. Eternal business requires eternal resource. And so I just want to offer you tonight the fact that I believe that God has brought you to a sacred place. He's brought you to a tent of meeting. He has brought you to a point in your life where you need to ask these questions. If I am going to represent you fairly in this world, that is, am I going to represent Jesus Christ? Will I cast shadows on who Jesus is? Or will the transformative, restorative, redemptive power of Jesus Christ shine brightly through my life? And I don't know about you, but that is a serious question. That is a really big deal. It was a big deal to Moses when he had his back against the wall. It was a big deal to Isaiah even when he had seen God in all his glory. And it was a big deal to the Apostle Paul, who in a sense was in that passage trying to differentiate between the old equation of life and the one that Jesus offered. The old has passed away, he says, the new has come. So my suggestion to you tonight is that these moments are not simply the attendance at another meeting. They are a point in destiny where God wants to intersect your life with his agenda in an extraordinary way, a way that you have never realized before. Lord Jesus, in this room are